In today's teaching, we'll be talking about step 2 of translation, making a first draft. So here once again are the 10 steps of translation. First, we do exegesis in order to understand the text, and then we make a first draft. The next steps help us to test or check the translation. We have a team check, a reviewer's check, community testing, and we do basic scripture checks. Then we do a back translation to get the text ready for the consultant and a consultant check. Then a final read aloud, and we prepare to publish. So looking at those first two translation steps, in step 1, exegesis, we study the text. Before beginning to make the first draft, the translator must be sure that he understands the source text well. Then step 2, making a first draft, re-express the meaning of the source text into the receptor language in a way that is accurate, clear, and natural. So that's what we'll be talking about during this presentation, how to do that. There are 5 steps we can do in drafting that will help us produce a good quality translation. The first is to study the notes that we made when doing exegetical research, questions we asked, the answers we found, and ideas on ways to render those things in our languages. Next is to really think through the text. Read it over and over. Say it in your mind over and over. Then you will know, understand, and be able to tell it naturally. Next is to draft either in written or oral form. After that, revise the text. And finally, read aloud to make sure it sounds natural and things are clear. So let's look at that first step, study. Carefully review the results of your work on exegesis, especially any difficult items in the passage, such as unknown ideas, figures of speech, key terms, or differences in multiple versions. Note down how you intend to translate these things into your language. So that is part of studying the text in order to know how we are going to translate things. So here is Luke 10:25, which you'll be translating, in several different English versions and in English back translation. So let's say you've gone through this when doing your exegetical research, and you've identified areas of difference and what you would like to do with those. So for instance, in looking at sentence connectors, ESV has and, the last two, NLT and LEM-EBT, have one day, and GNT doesn't have a discourse connector at the start of this new section. So you'll need to review your notes on what you decided to do with those differences, how you want to translate. The word lawyer in one translation, expert in the religious law, teacher of the law, or scribe. Once again, differences in this key term, and as a result of your research, how you've decided to translate that in your language. 2 of the translations say to test Jesus, and 2 say to trap him. So once again, look at your notes and review how you have decided now to translate that in your first draft. And then another key term, eternal life. All 4 versions are the same, but once again for this key term, how will that best be expressed in your language? So review your notes as you get ready to make that first draft. The next step is to think through what you are actually going to write or say in making the first draft. For me, this is one of the most important steps and one that is most often overlooked. Often I find that translators will just start typing or writing verse by verse. Oral Bible storing is very strong in that it helps translators think through the passage in advance to make sure they really understand before translating. And we can also do that when doing written translation. So stop and think. Visualize the event in your mind. Rehearse the passage in your mind. Go over it several times, thinking what you will write or say. Compare different versions for ideas, and look at your notes for help. The next step is to make the actual first draft. So to type or write or say what you have rehearsed in your mind. Try to write full ideas in order to keep the flow. So drafting isn't just word for word, looking at a version and then typing that into your translation. Try to think in whole, complete sentences, and that will help ensure that the translation is natural in your language. The next step is for the translator who made the initial first draft to revise his work. Yes, this will be done later by the other translators in the team check, but it's good for him to do it as well. So compare your draft with several different versions. Make any necessary changes so that it's accurate and clear. Nothing omitted, nothing added, the meaning not changed. The final step in making the first draft is to read the text aloud. So read it aloud to yourself or to someone else. And I must stress, it needs to be aloud. Don't just read it in your mind. Because as you read aloud, you can listen for anything that sounds unnatural. That would be then something that you would need to revise. As translators, we need to be willing to improve our first drafts. The first draft is just the beginning. Yes, the text now may exist for that verse in paratext, but expect to make many improvements. Revise and test. Test and revise again. Here is an analogy comparing drafting to making a sketch. The first draft is like a rough sketch. In the drawing below, it was done in pencil. Later changes add detail, color, texture, highlights. The final work looks just like the real thing. And that's what we want for our translation as well. The first draft might not be completely accurate or clear or natural, but as we work on improving it, we can end up with a high quality translation. We'll be talking later in the workshop about testing the translation, but here is a way to improve a draft, and that's to retell the story that you've drafted. You can ask other people to retell the story in their own words. And by listening, you may find words or expressions that will improve your first draft. In drafting, as we did with exegesis, first think big. For me, this means thinking through the whole passage, internalizing it and saying it in your mind, and writing that then as your first draft. Then think small. Focus on the details and get them right. Compare your first draft against other versions to make sure that you haven't left anything out or added anything. And then think big again. Does it all connect well? When you do a read aloud, is it natural sounding and clear? One important area, in order to make sure your first draft is clear and accurate, is logical connectors. In order to get logical connectors correct, first start thinking small, phrase by phrase. how those phrases fit together, then sentence by sentence, verse by verse, paragraph by paragraph, and even section by section. Here are some dangers to avoid. I know we've already emphasized this, but don't start translating without having first carefully studied the meaning of the source text. So comparing that text in different versions and using the translation reference tools so you really understand the meaning. Also, don't allow first drafts to pile up without revision and testing. As you revise and test, your first draft will get better. And we want to improve the quality of our future first drafts as well. This is a hard one, but don't be afraid of criticism. As others give input to improve the text, they're not criticizing you. They know you've worked hard. But every text can be improved. Don't think the first draft is ready to publish. Even a good first draft is only a beginning. So expect to make a number of revisions to achieve a good, polished translation. So now let's talk about what knowledge and skills are needed to make the first draft. Well, as we've said, an understanding of the original message. Step 1, exegesis. An ability to speak the receptor language fluently. So the person making the first draft should be a mother tongue speaker of the language and not a foreigner who has learned that language later. That way it will be completely natural. An understanding of translation principles and the ability to apply them. In many projects today, there are 3 translators on a team. So if there are several translators, who should make the first draft? One option would be at the beginning of a project, all the translators could sit together to make the first draft. Now this first option has as a strength that those weaker in exegesis, or translation principles, or computer skills, learn from the stronger team members. However, this can lessen the impact of the team check step. And so it's usually not done like this later in a project. It's also not the most efficient way to work, since while one is making a first draft, the others can be doing other tasks. Option 2 would be that each translator can draft a separate chapter. However, this can result in stylistic differences between those chapters. But probably the best option would be option 3. One translator, the strongest at drafting, can draft the entire book. The other translators can work on keyboarding if necessary, if the person making the first draft is writing rather than typing the text. They can work on a team check of passages already drafted. Or if no one outside the team can be found to make a back translation, they can work on that. So who makes the first draft? Well, with new teams, it can take some time to find out which translators have skills in which areas. Be prepared to adjust who does the first draft to make the workflow as efficient as possible. Now, in some teams, you may be tempted to assign the task of making the first draft to the oldest person on the team, or the person with the most education, or the oldest man on the team. But you really need to find out who has the greatest skill in making a good quality first draft. It's much easier to edit a good quality first draft than to try to make lots of changes to one that isn't quite so good. So we really need to take time and see who on the team would be most suited to this task. I mentioned earlier that after making the first draft, the person making it can then compare his first draft against other versions to make sure he's not left anything out or added anything or changed the meaning. He could also compare that first draft against other back translations. In some projects, translators are able to use a back translation from a related language. And that's helpful since adjustments made for the linguistic or cultural needs of one target language might also apply to a related language. So they can be very helpful to look at. Here are a few cautions for using other back translations. Many back translations may be available in paratext from other regional languages or related languages. Now, some may have been revised during the consultant check so that changes made during the consultant check were updated to the back translation, but others may not have been. So the back translation may no longer accurately reflect the translation and the changes made in the consultant check. So use caution. Back translations in other languages can be great for ideas, but don't give them the same authority as other published translations. In summary, remember in drafting that the first draft is just the beginning. Be ready to listen to the suggestions of others. Translation is teamwork. Be ready to test and revise, then revise and test again. Our goal is to improve the translation to have the highest quality translation possible. Now, if this teaching were being done in a workshop setting and not online, at this point I would ask an experienced translator from a project related to yours to come and share with you for 5 minutes on his experience with drafting. If you have that opportunity, I'd encourage you to do it. I think you'll learn from others who have gone through this same experience and have seen helpful ways to do things. So that is the end of today's teaching on making a first draft. I'd like to emphasize a few of the important things that we talked about. The first is how important it is to really internalize the text before making the first draft. So thinking through in your mind what you are going to say in complete sentences before you start writing or typing. The other thing that is very important is to discover who is best on the team for this task of making a first draft. Who has those skills that will enable them to produce a good quality first draft? Because it's a lot easier to slightly revise a good draft than it is to heavily revise a draft that needs more work. So once this second step of making the first draft has been completed, you are then ready to go on to step 3, the team check. That's all for now. See you later. If you're taking this training as part of a translation workshop, you'll see in the green box on the workshop schedule that we've just finished step 2, drafting, making a first draft. That was a short presentation, so also during this class time, you'll see in the red box, we'll be going over drafting, step 2, keyboarding the text.